While attending a liberal arts college, I've more closely become a spectator of the political climate of the world. And in doing so, I've become more aware as an artist. I found myself becoming increasingly upset at the choices of certain nations involving themselves in foreign affairs over the past few years. I thought to myself, what right do we or any other governments have to just butt in like that? Like, how imperialistic of these privileged nations, and in our modern society, quite frankly, I thought we were past that. To me, all acts of imperialism are at their core acts of greed. I made it my goal to use my senior thesis exhibition to visually bring light to this universal avarice. I wanted the pieces I created to serve as an aesthetic reminder of that which happened in the past, to relay that it's also rampant in our modern world. I chose to demonstrate my concept by juxtaposing the high-class, lavish, and undeniably opulent style of aristocrats in the French pre-revolution era with the ill effects of its regime. These ills include the wrongful death, religious limitation, cultural depreciation, and overshadowing of many indigenous populations that fell victim to imperialism. In doing so, I resolved that my pieces would be created in the likeness of the Baroque and Rococo art styles because they help to convey a sense of wealth and frivolity that the aristocrats of my choice enjoyed. I decided early on that the paintings I wanted to produce for the show would be a triptych, or a series of 3. The largest painting is a recreation of a famous court painting of Louis XIV of France by Hyacinthe Rigaud. I integrated elements of memento mori, or symbols of death, and visual references to colonialism. This includes anything from human skulls to golden ore, or even historical symbols such as the fleur-de-lis. My other paintings are recreations of the court paintings of Madame de Pompadour by François Boucher and Marie Antoinette by Gautier d'Agoty. The reason for the smaller size of the pieces is a social statement on the difference of status and rank of women in power. One might typically think that a queen or privileged woman might have more, but the fact is that gender discrimination is realistically subjective across all classes. Their positioning on the outer sides of Louis is representative of the supporting role that women have upheld in history. So you see, I'm trying to address a sort of irony in the history of man, that one gender is held above another in Western power structures, but is however driven by the opposing gender's presence. I'm using both a wife and a mistress to broaden the audience's association of these women to their duty. I decided to use a quote by Voltaire that goes, "It is not enough to conquer, and one must learn to seduce," to emphasize this. Similarly, the text that I placed across Louis reads, "It is legal because I wish it." This is actually a quote by Louis XIV himself, and I found it very dogmatic. It works perfectly to convey the shockingly real and often masculine daftness of blatant power. One question I've gotten a lot has been, why did I pixelate the faces of the aristocrats? I did this to point out to the viewer that I am not holding these specific figures of the French absolute monarchy responsible for all of colonial ruin, but rather their actions, possessions, and status, which can be applied globally to all imperialistic regimes. My sculpture, Impossible Feast, is one of the pieces that I've been sketching for about 2 years now. The laws of gravity do not apply to this party. The place settings all remain firmly attached to the table, and it would seem as though physics has simply left us. The meals on the table consist of royal luxuries and delicacies, but rotting and inedible. The food itself is a combination of found objects and hand fabrication, much of which I sculpted from construction-grade spray foam. I then faux painted it and mimicked mold by using things such as tree moss and hand-pulled particles of felt. This sculpture for me is representative of the fairy tale notion of imperialism and the unsustainability of such a regime in the modern day. I'm influenced a lot by Judy Chicago's Dinner Party and The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Another very relevant historical reference would have to be Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum exhibit, specifically referencing the piece comparing and contrasting silverware and shackles. Umbra Deus translates roughly to Shadow of God in Latin. This piece, which is more of an assemblage, explores the direct influence of Christianity on global expansion throughout history. The books I acquired are themes such as politics in Eastern Europe or God in history. The sword symbolizes the missions as well as religious influence of the motives of nations who have had militaristic power. The cast shadow of the sword is a subtle reference to the Christian cross. Clay has always been incredibly special to me. Taking a raw material and molding it with your own hands to create something from what was once nothing, there's magic in it. I've been using it since middle school, and it's really where my technical skill took off. It's so much easier to work two-dimensionally when you can experience your work in a three-dimensional space. Both of the ceramic sculptures I prepared for this show took about the full fall semester to produce. Colonization is modeled after the style of Marie Antoinette. I sculpted this piece out of Maccabee clay to achieve a smooth and pure finish that was similar to marble. This was also essential for capturing the higher level of detail. A honeycomb pattern covers and consumes bits of the woman's face and neck. This is to impart how colonization was a consuming force and, in a way, almost like a disease. My presentation of the piece on opening night of the show included a small but very special guest, or many guests. With the close help of the Stetson Beekeeping Society, I enclosed a group of bees within a protected vitrine. The presentation of this piece was highly influenced by the work of 1,000 Years by Damien Hirst. The piece Gilt shared a similar unveiling, being accompanied by a tarantula on opening night. I sculpted the human bones to be as anatomically accurate as possible, consulting Gray's Anatomy throughout the entire process. For this piece, I used white earthenware to make sure that the bones were as strong as they were smooth. Once the bones went through a firing in the kiln, I hand-painted a floral pattern to mimic the style of teacups and fine china. I furthered this by accenting the edges with gold paint. This piece demonstrates the ornamentation, beautification, and in many cases the false justification of murder in the name of power. Creating this collection was not only an exploration of the modern political state of mind, but also a personally fulfilling artistic venture. I've been planning and sketching quite a few of these pieces for as many as 2 or 3 years now. To see them finally realized, brought to life, and exhibited was incredibly satisfying as an emerging artist. Before I knew it, the show was up and ready to come down again. But that doesn't mean that it's over. Imperialism today, especially in America, is virtually inescapable. Like royalty, it's something into which we're born. Even though it isn't quite associated with the same brand of splendor and excess that the history books show us, we, by the virtue of being American, are part of the system. One does not need to hold office in government, be a religious official, or even be insanely wealthy to engage. It's evolved over time, just as people do. In this, one must also recognize the inherent dichotomy of power. Those with power often do things, however unspeakable to the average citizen, because they're convinced that it's the right thing to do. That's what I really want people to ponder when they look at my art. Are the powerful to blame for misfortune, or are we all simply products of the struggle for power?